I'd like to share with you a simple list of the most predictive questions of one's Googleyness in job interviews. And I'd like to explain in one sentence how did I get to this list. First, I looked at Google's 10 things, which you could also say they're closest to a company's guiding principles. And more interestingly, Sundar Pichai has an article in 2024 where he highlights 6 key mantras. Basically, those would get even closer to the behaviors that Google would be most interested in while screening candidates. So I put this together into the most representative behaviors, and together with my expertise of coaching candidates since 2018, I arrived to a list of 7 questions which are the most important to prepare for a Googleyness interview. First interview question. Tell me about the time when you had to handle a conflict inside your team and what was the outcome. This is a direct reference to Google's Team Google. And it basically means that Google is highly interested in team players. And one of the best ways to screen someone on whether you're a team player or not would be to ask about conflict resolution. Right now, 5 years ago, one of the most common issues while answering conflict resolution questions were candidates being slightly aggressive in their approach of handling conflicts with colleagues. Nowadays, what I found is that there's a tendency for people to share examples of conflict resolution that are too light, too safe, and too uninteresting. So what is the best way to answer conflict resolution questions? Well, first, let's say for mid-level roles, the best way to answer, tell me about time you handle a conflict with a colleague or inside your team, would be to link to some data that you find, right, to make your point around this conflict, and then to present this data to your colleague or inside your team in a bid to earn their trust. So this is the most basic and one of the most efficient ways to answer conflict resolution questions, except if you are applying for a senior leadership, a director level role. Directors and senior leaders would also want to take into account answering conflict questions in a way that you would interpret them as an ability to influence, right? So even the question themselves would be slightly different for Team Google. In the case of a director level role, they would be more targeted to the influence side of things. So how do you influence would be the right question to ask yourself here for such roles, right? How do you influence? Well, maybe you build partnerships. Maybe you read, you know how to read people well. Maybe you again, gather some data and these sort of things. It's a different level. It's important that you answer the conflict questions with examples that are representative for the level that you're applying for. So in other words, if you're applying for a director of a role and you talk about a small friction with a colleague that was nothing really important, didn't really drive a major business outcome, then it might be perceived, as too safe, and it won't sell yourself to the best of your abilities. The second question to prepare for the Googleyness interview is, tell me about the time when I took a risk in a fast-paced project. I believe the second of Google's 10 things is fast is better than slow. So your ability to move fast, to have speed in your decision making is critically important to score well on Googleyness. How do you answer these types of questions around speed? Well, ideally, what I would suggest is you refer to a non-critical business decision where, speed was more important than taking the right decision. Because if you would talk about a decision that was not critically important for the business, then you could explain the pros and cons. You could also have a little bit of leverage. You could take risk, so to speak, for the sake of delivering quickly. For example, if you have to give an estimation over a project's delivery, you don't have all the data on your end. Maybe your manager wants this answer as quickly as possible, so you would want to deliver this estimation as quickly as possible, because again, it's not something critically important and you can change your mind afterwards. So this is how I would go with a general framework of answering speed questions. The third question when it comes to Googleyness is tell me about a calculated risk which you took and did not go as planned. What did you learn and how did you manage the fallout? So remember, the previous question was a time when you took a risk in a fast-paced project. There's no reason for you to choose a failure, an unsuccessful risk, but you took a risk successfully, right? Well, this question is asking you when you took a risk unsuccessfully. These are also known as the failure questions, right? Why would these be failure questions? So indicative of one's Googleyness. Well, if you think about be bold and responsible, you take ownership of your mistakes, then you would understand that the best answers to failure questions would be ones with the best learnings. Candidates who took ownership of the problem they faced. Because what happens, it's quite common in job interviews especially when a candidate hears this for the first time, you would say, hey, you know what, I'm not going to talk about the failure, I'm going to talk about something minor, say, hey, don't worry, it was nothing interesting, and then I'm going to move on, right? This is when compared to a candidate who took this question and prepared it in advance, you are far more likely to speak about an actual failure with actual impact, ensuring that you would speak 50% of the time about the learnings, how you grew from that, and how you how you took responsibility for this. So this is why failure questions are also extremely efficient to screen someone on Googleyness. Question number 4. Tell me about a product, service, or solution which was already receiving good customer feedback, but you decided to do more. This is what I call a trick question, simply because it's very hard to understand why the question gets asked in these job interviews. And this is usually on purpose. If you think about Google's one of Google's 10 sayings, great isn't just good enough, then you have a valuable tip here on what they're actually looking for here. So what happens is that the traditional way, how most candidates would answer this question, would be to talk about, I don't know, maybe a product, a service, a software thing that was working reasonably well, but it still has some bugs, which you fixed and then delivered an even better service for your user, for your customer. Exceptional candidates would answer this question with something along the lines of, I looked around the corner and found some interesting innovation to wow my users. IntelliSense was a great innovation. It predicted what you're going to type next. It was accidental, but still it was emphasizing the candidate's high standards when it comes to delivering for the user. You could be delivering to your manager, whomever your primary customer is. But the whole point of this interview question is to screen someone's standards. So people with high standards would talk about wowing, would talk about exceptionally high quality products or services, whilst the other candidates would talk about fixing bugs. When thinking about a time when you decided to do more in the context of a product, service, or solution which was already working reasonably well. Question number 5. Tell me about the time when you had to pivot away from a project you loved because company's priorities have shifted. How did you handle it? So, to put it simple here, why this question gets asked, you'll know probably of Google's mission first approach. This, I believe, was from Sundar Pichai's one of those 6 key mantras. Basically, what they're asking you here will be to someone able to commit to a group decision, team decision, even though you may not like working too much on that specific initiative, but simply because that initiative creates value for the user and basically works towards Google's mission, right? Now, these types of questions on your ability to commit to, working on something that you may disagree with, is actually quite present as a behavior also in other companies. Another trick question could also be, tell me about a time when you had to commit to a group's decision even though you disagreed. And while this question might sound, relatively straightforward, what I can tell you is that what actually happens in job interviews is candidates would prefer talking about the time they committed to a decision which turned out to be the wrong decision. And then they proved, their manager or whomever took that decision, haha, I got you. When in fact, the best way to answer these interview questions about a time when you had to pivot away from a project you loved because company's priorities shifted would be to talk about the time when a company priority was the right thing for you to work on, not just because priorities have shifted, but because genuinely speaking, that initiative was far more important than something you just loved working on, right? So this is what it means to be mission first and your ability to commit if you want a behavioral interviewing approach. Question number 6. Tell me about the time when you were 75% to a project, program, or solution and had to pivot strategy to ensure its successful completion. Now, one of the least advertised behaviors or Googleyness factors in job interviews with any high-performing companies is one's ability to deliver, right? If you can sell yourself as someone who can deliver for your user, for your customer, whomever your primary customer or your end customer is, then in my opinion, you're halfway through to a job offer. And this is one of the most common interview questions. A time when midway through a project, you encountered some problems which you had to overcome, some challenges you had to overcome in order to deliver results. Another very important point here is that I know at least many of my clients also have academic backgrounds. And what happens here is that people with academic backgrounds would have a tendency to talk about their academic achievements, which may not connect well with your ability to deliver. What happens here is that usually when speaking about when selling yourself and your ability to deliver for the user, you know that in real life situations, these projects can get quite messy, and usually people who deliver well can get quite scrappy with these things. So what happens is that if your expertise is primarily from an academic background, there's still perfectly fine examples, don't get me wrong, but you should focus about presenting it as a real world delivery, even try to highlight its commercial side of things if at all applies, because this is what means the most to your ability to deliver. Now, I know from my experience the discussion is far more interesting once you understand, hey, what does it mean to be able to deliver for your specific role? What does it mean to be able to deliver, more importantly, for the job description that you're applying for? And when you take these two into account, then you'll understand that the choice of stories you would want to present for the purpose of a job interview will evolve. And the seventh question that, in my opinion, is also highly predictive of one's Googleyness would be the most commonly asked interview question in job interviews today, that tell me about yourself. And I would even dare to include the why Google or why this role, why now. In my opinion, you could prepare them at once. You could even save some time. But still, the main point here is that it's worth preparing your introduction in job interviews even more than previously, simply because nowadays, in the age of AI, expectations have evolved. So what happens here is that if everyone else prepares this because it's so easy, it's so easy to prepare your introduction while it's Google, and you will not prepare it and you will come across as, unprepared, then you risk, a rough start. So this is one of the core reasons what I would highly suggest you tell me about yourself and why Google quite seriously, because it's a matter of starting strong during this Googleyness or these leadership types of interviews. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.